Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Emotional Eating Unwrapped. I'm excited to be here with you today recording another episode, and this one is really good. It's one that I think is important to talk about, especially as we talk about emotional eating and different types of emotional eaters. And it's really important to recognize that emotional eating isn't just a one size fits all. There's many different reasons, there's many different triggers, there's many different types of emotional eating. And sometimes if we don't see ourselves or recognize ourselves in the way emotional eating is being described in certain areas, whether that's on social media, whether that's in mainstream media, or just anywhere, you might only hear a certain type of emotional eating be described. And so today I really want to go through the different types of emotional eaters because it's definitely one of the main things that we need as humans to heal is to feel seen. And that is what I want this episode to be. I want you, if you sense that maybe you're an emotional eater, but you don't fall into a specific category that you might feel is an emotional eater, perhaps the episode today will help you find some resonance and give you some sense of, like, okay, maybe I am an emotional eater. And then once you have that knowledge, once you have that knowing and that insight, you can take some next steps to heal. But we first have to have that initial recognition, internal recognition. So let's dive right in. Yeah, we're going to talk about the different types of emotional eaters, and it's going to be great. So, just as a reminder, I know I've talked so much on this podcast about my own story and about my struggle with emotional eating and how my relationship with food that was largely emotional started from when I was a teenager. And this isn't the case for everybody, but it definitely was the case for me. As a teenager, I definitely started struggling with anxiety. I started struggling with internal control issues. Like I really had a difficult time with uncertainty. I also had a really difficult time with puberty and my body image and just all that came with just being in a body and being in a woman's body and all those changes and all of the expectations and all the comparisons and just all of it, right? All the societal narratives. And I think as a teenager, it became really overwhelming just consuming all of that internally. And I ended up turning to food, whether it was compulsively or whether it was trying to control it, as a means to manage my anxiety. So when I go through the types of emotional eaters today, I actually have found myself in all of these types, and that might be the same thing with you as well. We can cycle through different types of emotional eating at different times of our lives. So if you hear or see yourself in more than one type, that's totally normal. So for me, when I was feeling edgy, when I was feeling anxious, when I was feeling lonely, when I was feeling insecure during the 15 or so years that I struggled with my relationship with food, I typically there would be two pathways for me in my emotional eating experiences, so to speak. So The first would be that I would start grazing. And I would start grazing, and usually it was just casual. I would be using food to soothe some of my edginess or take away the intensity of feeling lonely. And it would often start like that. And looking back now, maybe on some subconscious level, I knew that I was emotionally eating or that it would lead somewhere else. But I don't know. I think that what oftentimes that's what it would be. It would be a grazing thing. And what would often happen in those instances was that I would awaken to the fact that I was feeling gross, that I had eaten so much, or some sort of physical trigger would happen where I would wake up out of the grazing and I'd be like, "Oh my god, I just I don't feel great, whether that's physically or whether that's emotionally or something." And I would typically end up feeling ashamed, and then I would just say like, "Okay, F it." And I would give myself permission to binge. That was one pathway. And then the second pathway would be like a planned binge. Okay? So that would be something that I planned for. And oftentimes a planned binge would be like a reward. It would be a release and reward, right? So this happened after, usually would happen after I left a stressful situation that included relational people dynamics or relationship complexities, like a few intense days with like family or something, or like um a romantic encounter, something where I wasn't necessarily able to feel as free to have my own autonomy per se, right? So say like I just felt um claustrophobic in a certain extent. Not that there's anything wrong with what anyone else did, but I personally felt claustrophobic. And there was this intense feeling, like emotionally claustrophobic, I'm saying. And there was this intense feeling. Or it would be like I just finished something like a work project or a school project. Again, it would be this feeling of like heightened intensity, and then it would be a release. And basically, for me, food was where I went to get that release and reward lever, where I would go to pull that release and reward lever. And I used food to fill the emotional need for release and relaxation. Okay, so these were my two ways, basically, my two pathways, and the ways that I particularly found myself emotional eating. And one of the biggest aha moments so many of my students and clients have is realizing that the unwanted 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds that they're holding on to, and they're not letting go of, no matter what meal plan they try or what, diet in disguise that they try or whatever it is. And they realize that the reason why that the results aren't happening isn't because of a food thing, but it's because they're an emotional eater, right? It's because they are an emotional eater, and there are behaviors and dynamics and patterns with eating that, just like I had said, were unconscious, and then I brought them to the consciousness. The same thing for you, the same thing for them, and maybe the same thing for you too. So today we're going to go beyond the surface level, and we're going to break down the most common types of emotional eating patterns based upon the triggers that cause the behavior. And like I mentioned earlier, just like in my own story where I mentioned I have fallen under a few of the different ones that I'm going to talk about today, and I'm sure there are others as well. So feel free to DM me if there's another one that you think that you might fall into. I would love to hear if I missed something, but you might fall into more than one. So just remember that that might be the case for you. So let's go. So the first one I'm going to talk about is depressed eating. Okay, so are if you're an emotional eater that feels, that turns to food when you're depressed, that means that typically there's a feeling of emptiness or blahness that leads to a desire to feel sensation and excitement from food. Okay, so you're feeling blah, and then you're turning to food to feel some sensation or some excitement. And essentially, this can sometimes happen when you feel like you're not enough and you're comparing yourself to others, or you're doom scrolling through social media. That's kind of how you can feel that depressed, sunk feeling. Those are some examples of that. Okay, so the next one that we're going to talk about is anxiety eating. Okay, so anxiety eating is when life throws curveballs at you and stress becomes overwhelming. Many of us turn to food as a coping mechanism, right? So, this is, I think, probably one of the most common types of emotional eating when we're stressed and we have some edginess feeling, and we turn, there's uncertainty, and we turn to food to find grounding. And what happens is it's like a temporary quick fix. And it's a temporary quick fix from the chaos in our for people that emotionally eat because of anxiety underlying it. A feeling of not being in control could be a huge trigger. And some examples of not feeling in control are uncertainty, future tripping. So worrying about the future, something that hasn't happened yet, trying to plan ahead in a way where you can't really plan ahead. You're almost making assumptions, or you're catastrophizing, feeling pressure like whenever you're under a deadline, or just the internalized pressure just for thinking that you have to have resolution for things that you don't need to have resolution for yet. All right, the next one we're going to talk about is angry eating. So, this is when you emotionally eat because you have this huge sense of anger inside. There's this feeling of heat and just major sensation. And your nervous system is super activated, and you just don't like that feeling. Okay, so you've been triggered, you're mad, and maybe somewhere deep down, you don't like being angry. Being angry underneath feels not right for you, and you're not sure how to process anger. So that's something that's also really important to learn how to do, is to learn how to process anger in a healthy way so that you don't need to turn to food to calm your nervous system down. Because anger actually changes the physiology in your body. Anger actually has its own chemistry, its own hormones that get released. And we could almost unconsciously use food to take away that heat and that almost bitter feeling of anger. And we can use sweets. And that's why we often turn to sweets when we're mad, or salty food, because physiologically, actually, that takes the edge off. Okay, so learning how to process anger efficiently and effectively is so, so, so important. The next one we're going to talk about is bored eating. So I think a lot of people fall under this one too. So if you've ever found yourself snacking mindlessly just because you're bored, again, most common trigger, I definitely don't think you're alone in this. And it stems from not being fully present to your moment to moment experience, or a subconscious feeling of shame that you might have for doing nothing. Okay, this is a society thing. I think I've talked about this in a few of my other episodes, where as a society, we have this negative association with space, with boredom, where we think it's almost like a measure of our self-worth, that if we're not constantly busy or we're not constantly doing something, then we are just useless. And we could end up using food as an activity. We could actually use food as an activity to give that part of ourselves that validation that we're not useless and that we are doing something and we're not just a waste of space sitting around doing nothing. But what we have to do is reframe that to realize that space and time where nothing is happening is actually amazing for us. It's amazing for us from a restorative perspective for our bodies, and it's amazing for us for creative perspective. Some of the best ideas that I've ever had came from times where I was allowing myself to be bored. And there's energy there. If you actually let yourself be in the space and you let yourself be bored, you'll notice that inside there's a certain energy, and that's the creative energy. And if you're not used to feeling that energy, you might see that as it might feel like anxiety, or it might feel like um, judgment, and you might use food to quiet it down. But getting used to being in space, in boredom, is an amazing, amazing skill. Okay, so number 5, I think we're at now, is lonely eating. And loneliness is definitely one of the ones that was a big trigger for me, especially in my 20s when I was single living in New York. And, New York is a very solitary city. And yeah, I resonate with this one a lot. And loneliness could be a very powerful trigger. And it can definitely lead us to turning to food for comfort, for connection. Um, I talk about how food was my best friend for so many years. And, uh, the irony of it is in my 20s, when I was, a, a lot of times doing things alone and very, in a very solitary part of my life, I actually really enjoyed that. It felt really normal for me to be very independent. Um, but I do think there was a part of me looking back that wanted to feel more connected to people. And I don't think it's one or the other. I still am a very independent person. I love doing my own thing. I love my own, solitude. But there's a difference between feeling solitude and feeling isolated. And I think that's the important distinction. There were times that I think I was feeling isolated that I might have called solitude, and that wasn't actually 100% true. And I think there was a part of me that yearned for more intimacy, that yearned for closeness, and I wasn't really comfortable, or I didn't really have the skills to lean into that. And food kept me company when I was feeling lonely and isolated. Very different than when I was in solitude and just alone, which was a much more empowered feeling. And the last one that we're going to talk about today, which might come as a surprise to some people, but this is call this happy eating. So emotionally eating when you're happy. And while it might seem counterintuitive, some of us emotionally eat actually during festive, happy times. And this might be you if you're always celebrating with food when you're in a good mood or when something good happens, like if you get a raise or a promotion, or if you're at a party or at a social setting with high energy. And the reason for this is because we can associate connecting with other people with eating, instead of just seeing that we can connect with other people in other ways other than eating with them, or eating what they're eating, or eating the same volume as them or the same amount as them. That there's a way to feel connected to them just by being together. And there can also be some subconscious or even overt feeling of pressure to eat what everyone else is eating, right? So you might feel like a subconscious feeling to eat more, whether that's because you're worried there's not going to be anything left or you want to make sure you get enough, or you might even get overt pressure from people being like, why aren't you eating that? Right? So there's that piece of it. And then another piece is that oftentimes when we're with people and we're eating, I'm not saying this is for everyone, but for some, alcohol can also be a trigger to happy eating. And alcohol can also be kind of like a sneaky devil where we kind of give ourselves permission to emotionally eat after we've had alcohol. And so that's just something to just be aware to as well, if that's something that you do. And, think about what that means, right? Thinking about what that means. And so in all of these scenarios, it's important to ask yourself, what need is the emotional eating trying to tell me? Okay, so in all of these scenarios, that is what I want you to take away, that you're going to look at your unique triggers for emotional eating, and instead of judging yourself for it or being like, "Oh my god, that's me. How am I ever going to change?" The first way that you can change is by asking yourself, what is the need that this emotional eating behavior is trying to tell me? Because our eating behavior often gives us massive, massive insights into our deeper needs, our deeper values, and our deeper desires. So, for example, if you find yourself overeating in happy settings, there may be an underlying feeling of discomfort, right? Even though it's happy setting and it's festive, you might have an underlying feeling of discomfort. So you want to try to get to the root of that and then try to reverse engineer the eating behavior to help you figure out how to make yourself more comfortable in high energy social settings. And then once you recognize the primary triggers that you have, you can start uncovering the root causes and create new strategies for breaking these patterns and cultivating a new, less loving and healthier and more skillful and aligned relationship with food. Okay, so that is all I have today. I'm so glad you joined me. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode. And if you want to discover more about what type of triggers you may have, if you feel like you're an emotional eater, then I actually have a free checklist that you can download on my website where you can find out what type or what types of emotional eater that you are. You can just go to www.bewellbyak.com/emotional eating checklist, I believe. You can also find it on the homepage on my site, and you can find that out right now. So thank you again for joining me today. And don't forget to join me again next week with another new episode about emotional eating so you can fall in love with eating, start losing weight, and keep it off with sustainable strategies and lasting change. And if you found this episode insightful, please subscribe. Leave a review, please. That would be so great. And share it with those who may benefit from this empowering knowledge. And until next time, I'm Alana, and thank you for listening to Emotional Eating Unwrapped.